So let me give you an idea of the charges in this case. I've got a little chart, not too fancy really, but it helps to give an overview of what we're looking at. Is the chart up? Let me just advise. The jurors in the back row, you each have screens. Every other chair, there's something to your right. If you open it up, there's screens you can pull out. Can everyone see now? Thank you. Mr. Kelly? Sure. As indicated at the beginning by the court, there are 32 counts of charges in this indictment. It sounds complicated, but in many ways, it's fairly simple. First, there are 23 money laundering charges. That's mostly about real estate transactions that resulted in checks being made out to James Bulger. As you will hear, when people conduct financial transactions, like checks, with dirty money that is, money they made through crime, that's money laundering. And there are also 2 racketeering charges, which are basically about Bulger's criminal gang and all the crimes they committed. Racketeering charges include what's known as predicate acts or underlying crimes like drug dealing, extortion, murder. And to be considered part of a racketeering enterprise, you have to commit or agree to commit at least 2 racketeering acts. And in this case, Bulger's charged with 33. Now, there are also, as you see, 5 different gun-related charges about revolvers, pistols, and machine guns. And there's also 2 extortion charges. One is a conspiracy. In fact, several of these 32 counts, 3 of them, are charged as conspiracies. And a conspiracy is basically just an agreement between 2 or more people to do something illegal, whether it's a money laundering conspiracy, or extortion conspiracy, or racketeering conspiracy. Now, I said moments ago that part of the success of Bulger's criminal enterprise was due to its fearsome reputation. Other criminals were afraid of him, made the extortion payments, and that's true. But there was another part to their success. And the other part to their success was public corruption, because you will hear that Bulger and his friends made a point of paying off members of law enforcement. They did that so they could get tipped off to investigations and stay one step ahead of the honest cops who were actually trying to make a case against them. So it was part of a strategy they had, and it worked. You will hear about a state trooper named Dick Schneiderhan who took money and gave information to Bulger's group. You will also hear about FBI agents taking money and compromising investigations on behalf of Bulger, tipping him off to investigations that legitimate, honest cops were trying to make against him and his colleagues. And 2 of the corrupt FBI agents you'll hear about the most are guys named John Morris and John Connolly. And John Morris, he will appear before you at this trial, and he will admit what he did, and he will testify. Now, who was FBI agent John Connolly? Well, even though, as you will hear, Bulger liked to tell people he didn't like informants, or rats as he used to call them, the evidence in this case will be that Bulger was one of the biggest informants in Boston. Bulger routinely met with FBI agent John Connolly and gave him information, some true, some false, but all designed to protect himself, mislead other investigators, or get the competitive edge that he wanted. Now this in turn leads us to one of the grotesque ironies of this case, because you will hear about informant Bulger killing other people because the other people were suspected of being informants. Let me give you an example. May of 1982. There's a man named Brian Halloran. He was shot dead about a half mile from here on South Boston waterfront. Shot dead by James Bulger over there. And with him at the time was another man who died in a hail of bullets that Bulger unleashed. A guy named Michael Donahue, who had the misfortune to just be giving his friend, Brian Halloran, a ride home. So why did Bulger kill these 2 men? Bulger had learned from his own corrupt FBI connections that Halloran was trying to give information to law enforcement, just like Bulger was doing. Only to Bulger, this offended him because Halloran was trying to give information about Bulger's co-conspirators and colleagues in crime. Halloran was trying to tell the FBI about a murder that had occurred in Oklahoma. The Oklahoma victim was a businessman named Roger Wheeler. Roger Wheeler had refused to sell a Florida business he owned to some Bulger-related co-conspirators, and now Halloran was talking about it. And Bulger didn't like that. In fact, Bulger took action because he did not want the FBI to learn the truth about Roger Wheeler, because Roger Wheeler was, in fact, shot between the eyes after a round of golf in Oklahoma, sitting in his car, shot by one of his colleagues, John Martirano. So Halloran and his friend Donahue were gunned down in broad daylight in May of '82. And by the time this 1982 murder of Halloran and Donahue had occurred, Bulger and his co-conspirators had already killed 13 other people, because this little murder spree had been going on since the early 70s. All of these murders were committed to promote or protect Bulger's criminal enterprise or criminal gang. But like Michael Donahue, some of the murder victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the first murders you'll hear about in this case was part of the racketeering activities of a guy named Michael Milano. Now, Milano had nothing to do with Bulger, but Milano was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because in the early 70s, Bulger's gang was feuding with another criminal group headed by a guy named Al Notarangeli. And by the time this feud was over, 6 people were dead, including Al Notarangeli and his brother Joe. And Bulger's role in several of these Notarangeli-related murders was to drive a second car behind the car that was doing the shooting. Bulger was the crash car, designed to cause an accident to distract the police if they came to the scene and try to get the shooters. Now Milano, that's when he did the Milano murder. He was driving the crash car because his friend, John Martirano, was in the first car doing the shooting. But Bulger's crew basically killed the wrong guy. They shot Milano, but they thought he was Notarangeli. He looked like him, he drove a Mercedes like him, but it wasn't Notarangeli. It was Milano. And when they were done riddling his car with bullets, Notarangeli wasn't dead. Poor Michael Milano was dead. And inside the car with Milano was a friend and the friend's girlfriend. Milano was killed, the friend was paralyzed, and the girlfriend was wounded with a bullet. Her name was Diane Sussman, and she's going to come before you and testify and tell you about that terrifying day she experienced so many years ago. Now, most of the time, Bulger and his gang killed the person they set out to kill. You'll hear about victims like Eddie Connors. Eddie Connors was bragging too loudly and too much about helping Bulger's gang, and this made him a liability. So because in the criminal world, it's important to keep your mouth shut, and he wasn't keeping his mouth shut, he was talking. So what happened to Eddie Connors? He was told by one of the gang members to go to a phone booth in Dorchester for an important phone call. But when he got there was no phone call. Instead, death came calling. Death came calling in the form of this man over here, James Bulger, who riddled that phone booth with bullets. Bulger and his sidekick, Stephen Flemmi, ran towards the phone booth and shot it up, killing Eddie Connors. And I've mentioned now 2 of Bulger's closest co-conspirators, John Martirano and Stephen Flemmi. Like the defendant, Bulger, they are killers. And they were part of Bulger's criminal enterprise for many, many years. And both have been charged. Both have pled guilty to that. They were prosecuted and pled guilty. And eventually both agreed to cooperate. They pled guilty to participating in murders, extortion, money laundering, racketeering. They will both testify in this case. They will admit to you their crimes, and they will explain to you their friend Bulger's role in those crimes. Now you'll hear that Martirano ultimately got a sentence of 14 years. Not enough, but you will hear from him, and put this in perspective when you analyze his testimony, that originally he wasn't facing any murder charges. Originally he was facing gambling and money laundering charges. And by pleading guilty and confessing to murder, he basically doubled his punishment. Still not enough. But bear in mind when you listen to him, without his confession, there was never any murder charges against him. But he did confess, and he did cooperate, and he did help solve crimes that had been unsolved for 3 decades. Now you will hear from Stephen Flemmi. He too has admitted his role in many murders, and he will tell you about his relationship with James Bulger. Flemmi is serving a life sentence. And basically, Flemmi and Bulger were partners in crime for many, many years. They extorted people. They killed people together. They killed a lot of people together. But in fact, after several of the murders that Bulger and Flemmi committed together, Flemmi pulled the teeth out of the victims in the mistaken belief that would somehow prevent the bodies from being identified, not anticipating DNA testing years later. So clearly, Flemmi is a vicious killer. But just as clearly, the evidence in this case will show that he was James Bulger's partner for many years. Now, Flemmi and Bulger weren't just partners in crime. They were also partners in the informant business. Because like Bulger, Flemmi also met with FBI agent John Connolly on dozens of occasions and fed him information about criminal rivals. And like Bulger, Stephen Flemmi paid thousands of dollars to corrupt FBI agents. And like Bulger, Flemmi was paying off cops in order to get inside information that would help him and his colleagues escape prosecution from legitimate cops who were, in fact, investigating them. Now, Flemmi and Bulger were so close that Flemmi bought a house in South Boston right across from Bulger's brother's house. The houses literally faced each other. Let me show you a picture of that. On the right, if you're looking at the screen, is the Flemmi house, Flemmi's mother's house. And on the left is Bulger's brother's house. In the back, this isn't the best picture. I'll show you another one in a second. The very back, you can see the beginning of a screen house, a cabana, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it a screen house. You can actually see it much better from an aerial view. In the top right-hand corner is the screen house. It's a pretty large structure. In that screen house, it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's one of the places that the Bulger gang kept its gun and ammunition, because Bulger's criminal organization maintained a veritable arsenal of weapons, and that's where they kept a lot of it. So the weapons would be available when they needed it. You will hear that a lot of weapons were originally stored in Brookline at another co-conspirator's house, a guy named George Kaufman. And in the late 1980s, Kevin Weeks, the man I mentioned earlier, he brought the guns from Brookline over to the screen house at Bulger's direction. Now you will hear from Kevin Weeks himself as well, because he too was prosecuted and pled guilty. He too ultimately agreed to cooperate, and he will tell you about these guns in the screen house. At one point, shortly after bringing the guns to the screen house, Bulger wanted his own little stash, his own little set, in case Flemmy wasn't around and Bulger needed guns quickly. So you'll hear about how Flemmy bagged them up and Weeks took them from Flemmy and hid them for Bulger for many years. And those are the 14 guns at issue in this case. They include several revolvers and pistols, but 6 machine guns. And let me show you a picture, if I could, of some of those. On the right-hand side and in the middle are the machine guns I just mentioned. Now these are machine guns and pistols and revolvers there. These aren't the only guns that you're going to hear about in this case, because you'll hear how the state police and the DEA in January of 2000 searched the screen house I just showed you. They got a search warrant, went to the screen house in South Boston, and looked for what they hoped would be a stash of weapons. Unfortunately, when they got there, they only found 1 handgun and some ammunition, some miscellaneous items, because the guns that had been stashed there had been moved by Flemmy's son. Because Flemmy had found out, Flemmy was still in prison. Flemmy had found out that Kevin Weeks was cooperating, so he sent his son to get the guns out of there. So his son bagged up the guns and got them out of there. His son was a man named William St. Croix, different last name, but he was in fact the son of Stephen Flemmy, and you will hear from him in this trial as well. He too will testify, and he'll tell you how his dad, Stephen Flemmy, told him to go over there, get rid of those guns because Weeks has turned. Weeks is cooperating. So St. Croix did what his dad asked him to do, and he lugged some of the guns, the better ones, down to Florida where he was living, and he buried a bunch of them in Somerville in a piece of property he had access to. But because St. Croix also eventually cooperated with the police were able to find this part of the Bulger arsenal. Now I said that the screen house was important for 2 reasons, and it is. Because the second reason is that the screen house was the scene of a vicious extortion that you'll hear about. And they extorted a businessman named Richard Basheri, general contractor, at the screen house. Because Bulger and his crew didn't just demand rent and levy fines on drug dealers and bookies, sometimes they extorted businessmen who had the misfortune of crossing their paths. And that's what happened to Richard Basheri. Mr. Basheri is also somebody who will come into the courtroom and testify before you. Mr. Basheri found himself in a jam because he gave an opinion about a fence that was involved in a property dispute in Quincy. Now, unbeknownst to him, this fence and this property disputed affected Kevin Weeks. And because it affected Kevin Weeks, Bulger's young sidekick, Basheri was in trouble. And Basheri, who knew Flemmy, was summoned to the screen house. In fact, Basheri had built the screen house years earlier. But when he got there this time, to the screen house that he had built, it wasn't for a building project. Because when he got there this time, who does he encounter? He encounters an angry James Bulger, sticking a gun in his mouth.